So far, we've been talking about religion in a broader, more general sense as the kinds of rules that define how to interact with the supernatural. We can also talk about a religion, a particular set of such rules, a social institution within a single society. When viewed from this perspective, specific religions must be integrated with the other social institutions of their society. They must fit in, and they do. We can see this most clearly when examining the social statuses associated with the religious institution. In no culture is everyone responsible for all aspects of his own relationship to the supernatural. All cultures have at least a few individuals who specialize in religious rituals and beliefs and act as leaders, guides, or teachers for others. The shaman is a type of religious specialist found in many egalitarian societies all over the world. If a religion relies on shaman, it is known as shamanism. The shaman is a part-time medico-magico-religious practitioner. Well, what does that mean? A shaman is someone specially trained in magical or religious ceremonies and who performs those rituals on behalf of others. But shaman are only part-time specialists and are still responsible for their own subsistence and basic economic needs. Your textbook implies shaman are only found in hunter-gatherer societies, but they are common also in tribal societies around the world. The part-time nature of shamans' jobs are a good fit for the egalitarian structure of bands and tribes, where anyone who wishes to undergo a shaman training can do so. In most cases, shaman are primarily healers of supernatural ailments, hence the old derogatory term witch doctor. The shaman's healing services are only needed sporadically in small communities. While they may be respected and given deference in village debates, shaman are not typically community leaders in non-religious contexts. On the other hand, in hierarchical societies like chiefdoms or states, one is more likely to find priests than shaman. A priest is a full-time religious specialist, just as a chief is a full-time political specialist. The priest holds an official position within a formal religious organization. He or she acts as an intermediary between the worshippers and deities. In many such societies, the religious institution to which priests belong is an ecclesia, a legally established organization to which everyone in the polity must belong. Thus, priests may also be bureaucrats and part of the government. Because religion is integrated with the rest of society, it plays a role in social change. As the physical and social environments change around a society, so must the religion change as well. The various functions we discussed last time can give some clues as to how these changes occur. If a religion does play an ecological role, for example, then religious beliefs will change directly when the environment changes. A recent increase in how religious leaders talk about the environment is a good example. 20 years ago, one hardly ever heard about a Christian's duty of stewardship toward the environment, but today it's fairly common. More generally, we can see religion and religious change as reflective of change at a broader level of society. In many colonial situations, where markedly different cultural traditions are forced into close, prolonged interaction, the cultures eventually acculturate, becoming more like one another. In such colonial settings, religions also acculturate and may eventually syncretize. A syncretic religion is a hybrid religion that combines aspects of belief and ritual from several other religious traditions. The most familiar syncretic religions are those that arose in the Caribbean during slavery. African slaves were brought to the Caribbean and forced to adopt Catholicism, on the surface anyway. In reality, the slaves combined their indigenous African tribal religions with Catholicism to produce new religions. The two most well-established of these syncretisms are Santeria, which is today practiced mostly in Spanish-speaking Caribbean nations, and Vodun, more commonly known in English as Voodoo, which is more associated with French-speaking nations. Vodun and Santeria are often dismissed by larger religious communities as superstition, or, worse, devil worship. But from an anthropological perspective, they're fully formed religious traditions with developed theologies that address the same big questions of existence that Catholicism or Protestant Christianity do. Not all religious change is syncretism, however. Some new religious traditions arise as the result of a revitalization movement. Many now traditional religions around the world first started this way. As the name suggests, a revitalization movement is a religious movement that seeks to revitalize and energize a culture. They tend to occur in societies that are under large amounts of stress, either through outside interference such as invasions, or through internal disruption like epidemics or economic collapse. When the stress reaches a breaking point and the traditional religion of the culture is no longer able to serve the people's needs, a revitalization movement sometimes takes place. A single person, called a prophet, has a religious experience during which a deity gives him the mission of spreading a new religion. Though the religion is seen as new, it invariably combines aspects of the old traditional belief system with new ideas or aspects borrowed from neighboring cultures. If people follow this new religion, the prophet says, their troubles will be solved and the world will become a better place. Socially, the new religion of a revitalization movement often serves to bring people into better accord with the new social reality. They discard traditional ways that no longer fit the environment and adopt new, more adaptive practices. In spiritual terms, the new religion promises worshippers a better life, either in this world or the next, so it serves a great therapeutic function. If the new religion is effective and spreads, the revitalization movement is successful. The culture changes but remains largely intact. Eventually, the new religion may become a traditional religion and go through a later revitalization of its own. As I said, most familiar religions from an anthropological point of view began as revitalization movements. Christianity, of course, was a revitalization of Judaism, with Jesus as the prophet. Buddhism was a revitalization of Hinduism, led by the Buddha in the 6th century BC. Islam is a revitalization of both Judaism and Christianity, with Muhammad as the prophet. The major world religions that began as revitalization movements couldn't be studied while they were still in the revitalization phase, of course, because they predate anthropology. We only know that they were revitalizations because they preserved their own histories. But revitalization movements still happen, and some have been intensely studied by anthropologists. The most familiar modern revitalization movements have often been termed cargo cults. In the early part of the 20th century, as European colonials established an enduring presence in Melanesia, several such cults arose on various small islands. These religions were called cargo cults because of their focus on cargo, the most common term used by island natives to refer to European manufactured trade goods. Melanesian societies were traditionally tribal and egalitarian. Wealth imbalances that might lead to inequality had traditionally been corrected by big men hosting massive feasts and giving away wealth. Rich Europeans, on the other hand, stubbornly refused to do this. Confronted for the first time by their own relative poverty when compared to Europeans, various prophets arose with new ceremonies aimed at correcting the wealth imbalance through supernatural means. They applied the principle of imitative magic, the idea that things that are alike in one way are also alike in other ways. Worshippers therefore constructed imitation airplanes and false airports, believing that the deities would fill them with cargo, just as the deities had filled Europeans' planes. When such rituals failed to produce the desired cargo, many cargo cults faded away and vanished. But several endured, their theologies evolved, and they continue to this day with a different ritual focus. Probably the most successful and widespread revitalization movement in the world today is Pentecostal Christianity. This is a revitalization of mainstream Protestant Christianity that emerged in the United States early in the 20th century. The most widely cited origin point is the Azusa Street Revival, a years-long religious celebration in Los Angeles that began in 1906. This was led by an African-American preacher named William Seymour, who preached a kind of Christianity that largely rejected the mainstream hierarchical denominations of the day. His church attracted a wide variety of Los Angeles inhabitants, from all ethnic groups and all classes, with boisterous, exciting services that involved the congregation directly in dancing, singing, and an emphasis on direct interaction with God. As this message spread across the country, it merged with other, smaller movements within Christianity to form Pentecostalism as we know it today. Pentecostalism rejects hierarchy in church offices and is much more openly egalitarian. Many Pentecostal churches have no official leadership, or maybe only a single pastor. Congregants participate actively in the service, which seldom has a predetermined structure. Instead, Pentecostal services tend to emerge naturally from the collective worship of the congregations. Unlike the structure of older, more traditional Christian denominations, Pentecostalism empowers the individual worshiper over the church hierarchy. The focus of much Pentecostal worship is not liturgical rules, such as in a Catholic Mass, but rather charismatic experience. Charismatic derives from the Greek word charis, meaning gift, and refers to the gifts of the Holy Spirit, such as speaking in tongues, healing through touch, and prophecy. Pentecostalism teaches that these gifts come as a result of a possession trance in which the Holy Spirit, a deity, inhabits the worshiper's body and acts through him or her. Anyone can experience these gifts, though how widely they are experienced varies from congregation to congregation. Today, Pentecostalism is one of the fastest growing denominations of Protestant Christianity, both in the U.S. and in the developing world. It is most popular among lower socioeconomic classes because its egalitarianism gives a sense of control and self-determination. The rejection of rules and openness to individual experience also promises worshipers an opportunity to escape the economic and social stresses that dominate their lives otherwise. Another modern movement within world religions is the spread of fundamentalism. Fundamentalism in the general sense can be applied to any religious tradition. It means a strict adherence to what are believed to be the original rules of a religious tradition. Fundamentalist movements are revitalization movements in that they seek to revitalize and reinvigorate a religious community, but they differ from other revitalization movements in some basic ways. First, as with all revitalization movements, fundamentalist movements do incorporate new religious beliefs and rituals into their teachings. However, these beliefs are believed by the worshippers to be not new at all, but rather very old beliefs that had been abandoned by the mainstream religion. Whether the original religious community actually believed these ideas or not is largely beside the point. The modern community believes that they did, and they also believe that only a strict, pure, and absolute adherence to these original beliefs is proper. Also, most revitalization movements aim to spread throughout the society, hoping eventually to become the religious identity of everyone. Fundamentalist movements usually reject the larger society and segregate themselves from it. They define their own community identity in opposition to the mainstream society, which they see as corrupt and evil. Their goal is not necessarily to convert, but often to avoid corruption by avoiding interaction. The Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the FLDS, is a good example of a fundamentalist movement. It's a splinter group that broke away from the mainstream LDS, or Mormon, church. FLDS followers practice polygyny, a practice originally endorsed by mainstream Mormons but now prohibited. In some communities, they also isolate themselves in walled compounds away from the rest of society. In northwestern Arizona and southwestern Utah, however, members of the FLDS are numerous enough that such isolation isn't seen as necessary. Another recent fundamentalist movement was the Islamic State movement in Iraq and Syria. Their theology holds that ISIS practices a pure form of Islam practiced in the 7th century by the first generations of Muslims. This is despite good historical evidence that many of their interpretations of Islamic theology would have been directly opposed by early Muslims. That doesn't matter because to members of ISIS, such historical evidence is merely evidence of the corrupting influence of mainstream society. Historical records themselves are unreliable. Unlike many fundamentalist movements, ISIS aims to be universal. Rather than isolating themselves from corrupting outside influences, they seek to eliminate those influences altogether. Finally, we should also talk about another major development in the world's religious practices, and that's the spread of those with no formal religious affiliation at all. In Western societies, the 20th century saw a marked decrease in the role of religion in everyday life, a phenomenon known as secularization. This has not been a uniform progression, and religion plays a much more prominent role in American culture today than it did, say, 40 years ago, but much less prominent than it did 100 years ago. Secularization appears to be a phenomenon associated with modern Western society. In earlier ages, essentially everyone belonged to one religious community or another. Usually this was just whichever religious tradition was part of the society into which a person was born. In other more cosmopolitan times, people could choose from a variety of religious traditions that coexisted. But the idea of someone with no religion, a true atheist with no belief in the supernatural at all, was so rare as to be unheard of. Even the Roman philosopher Lucretius, who came closest of all the ancients to true atheism, believed in the gods. He just thought they were distant, uninterested, and uninvolved in the lives of us puny mortals. Today, of course, atheists are still a small minority in the West, but they have been increasing in number for several centuries. Much more common are those who claim to be spiritual, but not to belong to a religion. This can be largely seen as the result of the spread of individualism and an equalitarian philosophy around the world. As the global society increasingly rejects hierarchy and embraces self-determination, people feel freer to develop their own understandings and relationships with the supernatural. Economic development also makes it easier for people to reject community norms and go their own way. But crucially, most people still acknowledge the existence of supernatural powers and entities, and that might say something basic about human nature. We are, in some sense, religious beings.